Pow Comic Hour with your host, Andrew Glauner.
And Chris Ramos.
And tonight we are going to cover the first graphic novel, A Contract with God by the legendary Will Eisner.
Yes, long and very famously touted as the first graphic novel, not because it's the first collection that's ever been put together. That was a distinction that I was coming across a lot.
Yeah.
Was people were saying, yeah, it's not just because stories are in one book, right? It's not just like, hey, you could have done that with Popeye or anything else from this era. But it was because he built this with the full intention of it being an actual storytelling device.
Yes.
That was for adults, not just for the comic reading experience, but because he had a story to tell and he saw it as a start to finish, almost like a novella, sort of,
Okay.
with a spine that you could buy at a bookstore.
Right.
And so he wanted to elevate the comic book itself.
Yeah. And in many conversations, and I was listening to one on the way here, I'll reference later, but Will Eisner said the graphic novel and the nature of comic books, he wanted that respected just as much as prose and just as not much as novels right there on the bookshelf. And so he wanted this medium to be treated seriously, and he was such a big proponent of that.
Yeah. And even at that time too, I'm sure while he was going through all this in the 60s and 70s, that's when they had those real shock, like horror,
Yeah, there was a lot of underground. He was kind of saying that.
Real indie, right?
Yeah. And this was kind of like your first stepping stone to like what a modern graphic novel is today.
And what a serious tone you can tell for adults. Because if you say, oh, this is for adult comics, well, I think people immediately think, okay, so you're just telling like a story that's got nudity in it or something.
Mm-hmm.
But he was saying you can use this just as strong as any other storytelling device.
Yes.
And it was almost like a movie in a book, and he was the first one that saw
absolutely. And then I heard he wasn't the biggest movie fan. He was very much deep into his passion about books and stories and storytelling. He's also very known for sequential art. We'll get into that in the show. And really just was a steward and the godfather of the graphic novel. And so we'll probably only scratch the surface of the meaning of this book.
right.
But because there's so much to his life and what Contract with God meant to him. And we're only going to cover one part of this 3 novel series, the Contract with God series. But this came out in 1978.
And this one is Contract with God. There's 2 other stories in this book, right?
Yes.
In this graphic novel. But then there's 2 more graphic novels.
Yes.
That attach into a larger 3-book collection, right?
So it's Contract with God. Then there's A Life Force, and then it's Dropsie Avenue, The Neighborhood.
So there's 9 stories all rolled together.
Sure. And from what I understood, it's all in the same neighborhood of the Dropsie Avenue. It all takes place there, but each story is a standalone in its nature, and it's
a different.
It's like an anthology. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a kind of an anthology of stories.
So it's
kind of in the same place, just different points.
Same city, all different people.
Yeah.
But all probably, realizing their own little storylines.
Yeah. And some of this, Eisner, and contrary, some writers have different beliefs on this, but he really put himself into this book.
Mm-hmm.
He changed names of things like that, but to really bring about what it is and what it stood for. Absolutely. He wanted to tell something from the heart and make something out of this. And so gonna go find it. This book actually is the 7th edition that I picked up in short story. I picked this up at a con for $5. And I, cause I seen it, I'm like, oh, this is Will Eisner's book. Okay. I've never read a Will Eisner book. And at the time, I've been very interested in the history of comics and things like that. And you're this is the first graphic novel. hey, if I'm going to have a podcast, I should be talking about the first graphic novel. And that's kind of why we did this book, you know.
And years into the podcast, we decided, hey, let's go back to the first graphic novel.
Right.
But
And
a large part of that too is that you can't help but to see what is out in modern times and just keep working your way back. You know, work back. What's the influence of this? What's the influence? And keep going back into the past.
right. And so he kind of goes into like, let's see, I call it the attempted to work a major work in a similar form in futile effort to entice the patronage of Main Street publisher. I called it the graphic novel. It was a collection of 4 related stories drawn from memory, which took place in a single tenement in the Bronx. The title of the book, named for the lead story, became a contract to God. Through no major publisher would touch it at the time. This novel has remained in print for 27 years and has been published in 11 different languages. I followed this first effort with other more ambitiously constructed graphic novels, and they're all anchored on a single street and the borough of the Bronx in New York City. The street is Dropsie Avenue, and of the neighborhood that is nevertheless very real to me. And he kind of talks about this character and how he deals with God, where the street singer or the other story, you know, where the street singer fails to grasp for his chance for glory, or like some of the other ones that keep going on and on. But he very much talked about what he's seen and what he experienced growing up in that place.
Well, I think that really helps with any kind of story too, just to say this is my take on the world. You know, he's putting it through his lens.
Yeah.
You can tell though that his artwork, you know, because if you look at pages from like The Spirit.
Yeah.
So we don't want to jump all over the place, but Will Eisner was born a long time ago.
He was born
in the teens, I think.
Yeah.
19 teens.
Yeah, I want to say
like
1917.
And he right around 1940 he did get drafted.
Yep, he was 1917. Yep.
Born 1917. Okay. And then you said 20 years on he started working on The Spirit.
When he was 22, in 1940 he published The Spirit. Wow. Like, hey, what'd you do at 22?
Great. Yeah.
You know, I just launched this, you know, major comic.
But he had always been into comics and comic strips and artwork.
Really digging at finding those jobs.
Yeah. And I would imagine the time that he was growing up in his 20s, it was just like, if you were fast, because I did hear too that he was working on a Sunday short magazine form.
Yep.
And they were doing 16 pages a week.
Wow.
That's what they were drawing.
That's insane. Some people take months
crazy.
To do that. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Right.
I mean, in retrospect or in comparison, I think some modern comic books are running 2 or 3 pages, but you could tell his artwork too was just strictly pen and ink, a lot of ink washes, a lot of just black background silhouettes, and just really using the space on the page as background if you didn't really want to go through the whole thing.
Yeah. And so he was drafted. I'm trying to find out which war he was in, if he was in World War I or II. But he talks about, you know, he actually did some educational comics during
like instruction
in the service.
guides.
Yes, instruction guides. Oh, it's in the back in his bio.
So he must have early on realized as
a Pentagon-based warrant officer during World War II, Eisner pioneered the instructional use of comics, continuing to produce them for the U.S. Army under civilian contract into the 1970s, along with educational comics for clients as diverse as General Motors and elementary school children. So he did it all, man.
All right. Well, that's interesting because he was taking those, drawings as like a way to tell a story.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, I guess one thing led to another, right?
Right. And, you know, even though, and he kind of did it on his own, he published it on his own. He wrote and drew up like this whole series of books, right? You know, and inked, and he did the whole process.
Well, and it's funny, you look at it. So even just the artwork too, that's obviously what catches a lot of people. Even if you just picked up this book and flipped through it real quick,
right,
you'll notice right away he has like an old style of art, but it's not like super dated.
Hmm.
If you look at some of that as compared to some of the early, um,
Like your golden age.
yeah, like almost all the golden age, they really tightly fitted into panels that were just really small and you can only do like one or two motions. He took
Right.
like the whole page and
Right.
drew on it and really took
Wanted a
advantage of
lot of
that.
room to breathe on it and
And
see what's going on, interpret that,
yeah,
and
and the
used on it.
words are just as much of a presence on the page
Yeah.
as the artwork too.
And that's funny you say that because there's some narration, but compared to like his predecessors, there was this is nothing compared to the narration of like Golden Age
Oh,
comics. Like
right,
there's
yeah.
like da da da. There's a moment, there's like a sentence, then this next panel, and then there's a ton of dialogue, and you're like, I can't see the art.
I can't even see why you're drawing it.
You're right.
It's
Well,
just
have the characters say it,
yeah,
not
right.
like not what you're the narrator's saying. And he really actually, for like a first time reader of Will Eisner and going into this fresh, and did you read any, like have an experience with Will Eisner before reading this?
So I've seen a lot of panels and pages of the Spirit,
Okay.
and I've kind of read like larger snippets of it, right? But I haven't actually sat down and read
Like
like
a full
start to
story.
finish
Yeah.
story, right?
Right.
And I mostly have seen it because it always came up as like the best use of environments, because
Yeah.
in the
I could say
Spirit he
that.
always did like big cityscapes, and
Oh,
he
that's cool.
and all of his title pages were like words with people like crawling through them, and like
Oh,
like when you
okay.
used I want to say like movie credits and stuff where you see where they actually become part of their environment.
Sure.
He
And
was
he
really into
probably,
that,
yeah, he probably was really trying to figure out like what worked and what he liked, and
yeah, or
very
just
experimental in that way.
everything. I think the way he looks at it too is that everything that goes on that page has the ability to be a piece of art itself.
Yes.
So there shouldn't be anything on there that's just a stale anything. Like I think there's no coincidence that he still hand lettered all of his
Oh,
wording in
wow.
here when they could have just as
Hired
easily
out.
typed it out or
Yeah.
put it on at that point. If this came out in the 70s,
Yeah.
they can just plaster that in there from, a printout. But I'm sure
Wow.
he was like, no way,
He really
you know,
was very detailed and
right.
articulate
He
about it.
knew
Very
that the
particular.
lettering
What he wanted.
played out just as much. Yeah.
Yeah.
He knew what he wanted.
Um
A lot of people screaming and yelling. I mean, there's just no other way to do that than to just
Absolutely.
to draw
And he
those
doesn't really
words.
use sound effects compared to like some of the other comics of the day.
Well, that's a
But
good point too.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
no whoosh or
Yeah.
bam or pow. It's very much like you said, like, if there's a man screaming up at the window and it's raining, he wanted that emotion to say that in his words
And you can tell that it's
and his
raining and
emotion
it's windy and
and his
just
environment.
in his art.
Yeah.
You didn't have to say it. And he didn't need any narration like the wind was blowing. So, it's
Yeah.
like, that's it.
Right. And so yeah, we could get, it's a lot.
All right. So now we're done with the art gab.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so back to that point, I guess. You didn't need color. It's all black and white. It's so much emotion and it's very clean. Well, also like telling you, yeah, all those emotions that we talked about, all the action that's happening. This is not so much of a fighting. It's more like the human condition
Mm.
and kind of going through that experience and what they're feeling.
Well, and him not being afraid to tell this story.
Yes, absolutely. It's a pretty hardcore
It's a pretty
story.
bold story.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't read it to your kids.
That's not a bedtime story.
No. So yeah, I found here's another local summary for Contract with God. The first part of this book examines the subject of a man's relationship with his God. This very basic human preconception stems from the primal concern with survival. We are told early on that God will either punish us or reward us, depending on our behavior in accordance with a compact. The clergy provides the terms, edicts, and conditions, and our parents will enforce this contract. The creation of the story was an exercise in personal agony. Oh, yeah, that's light. And then he kind of talks about, his only daughter Alice had died of leukemia 8 years before this publication of this came out. And the original company came out. and his grief was still raw. My heart still bled, and in fact, he had a really tough time kind of like describing the story, but he really wanted to put this on the page and say that. So,
Mm.
kind of it's deep, but man, it really paid off, and it was fresh, and he really wanted to tell the story because it had a lot of meaning to him. And so it's really comes down to this man. He just lost his adopted daughter, Rochelle, and then he's trying to figure out how to make up for it. So he talks about doing good deeds, being a very selfless person, and he kind of ties that into making a contract with God, like, "Hey, I will keep being rewarded for this."
Like a literal contract he
Yeah,
writes out. Yeah,
you're
yeah.
right, absolutely, and he kinda wrote it on stone. Yeah, and, this is still taking place in New York and the Bronx, so, and it seems like a very, like, kind of like a neighborhood with poverty and things like
Hmm.
that, kinda going through that.
And that guy looks like he's really kind of down and out already.
Yeah.
But he's also walking through the rain in the first few pages.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of rain, but again, it just sort of puts you in that mood. You have to kind of like force the reader into that
Time frame.
style, or
Style.
like even just that culture.
Right, absolutely. And so, and he kind of this guy kind of lived through a war, through hard times and whatnot, and he really wanted to come up as an immigrant. And he kind of, and as an immigrant, he was Jewish, so Will Eisner was also Jewish,
Mhm.
and so he wanted to really kind of make that also like prevalent in this book.
Well, and you can see too, while he's putting in little pieces of himself in it, I think he's also just putting it in there because it probably makes him comfortable to write about it.
Yes.
Not that he's trying to like literally do an autobiography,
No.
but he's just saying, I kind of know a little bit about these kinds of
Sure.
things.
And I mean, if you didn't know that this was something Will Eisner experienced, like you could read it for what it is.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
It's just a human story. And so,
It's just like a real people. It's
yes.
not like superheroes and stuff. It's just real people.
Yeah. So like there's the famous page, when he finds out his adopted daughter died, and that was very dear to him, and just raised her from, when she got left on his doorstep as a baby till then. He's like, "No, not to me. You can't do this to me. We had a contract." And so that's
You
kind of
gotta
like him yelling out
you
to the
gotta
world.
read it. He's like, no. And
Right.
you see him screaming at the
Yeah.
sky.
And
He's in
it's
the
such
rain.
a legendary panel. You're
Yeah.
like, wow. Because you see that. And so he kind of disowns himself and dissociates himself with his God. And he's like, I've had enough. I've had enough of this. And so he kind of he goes into a very depression.
Well, and here's the thing too. I mean,
Yeah.
the story is very linear.
Yes.
There's no like flashbacks, and there's
Mm-mm.
no like areas for
No.
misinterpretation. It's
Yes,
like
it's literal.
this is the story.
Right.
And I think I really appreciated that because Will Eisner, the way he draws too, I don't even feel like he has any kind of pencils or anything. He just does it. He
Right.
just paints it with ink, and it's
Yeah.
on there. And you can tell that he's really like a master of his craft.
Absolutely. And
And
his line work is like
yeah.
spot on.
Well, even just the way that the page is laid out too, it's just like it's so easy to flow through and
Right.
be totally caught in that story. And that's what I always look for in books and stories and movies, is that you have to be totally caught into it. And then if something happens, like people talk about that in movies all the time, where it's like you're like into it, and you're like, oh, well, that's
Oh,
weird.
something pulls
And then
you
it
out.
pulls you out, and you're like,
Mm.
I don't know.
Right.
This one, you're in that mood from page one.
Right. And you're feeling like when his daughter dies, you're like,
Yeah.
wow.
Well, and even as you're working through it
Yeah.
too, he decides to, you kind of see him meet other characters. At first, it's
Yes.
just him, and then it kind
Yes.
of layers and layers
Oh,
and
right.
layers, right?
Yeah. Because you don't see the whole cast of like people in the city at once.
Yeah, you think it's just this guy, like this
Right.
guy's story. Well, then you realize, well, it's it's kind of
So
like
he is doing some world building.
he's trying to say, hey, if you think he's already in this sort of deep and dark world, he shaved off his beard and kind of started fresh,
over.
right?
Yeah.
So then you start getting introduced to other people. But
where he becomes a tycoon.
Yeah. And it's kind of like that,
the total 180. Yeah.
What is the hero's like?
The hero's journey?
The hero's journey, a little bit, where it's like he has this like he's the character, he experiences this tragedy, and he decides to kind of go in a different direction.
Right.
And then you as the reader have to figure out, is that direction sort of towards the good or towards just bad?
Sure, absolutely.
And
it wasn't very predictable of a storyline. It's still very like you have to keep you're invested in it, you have to keep reading it.
Yeah. So he decides to buy a parcel.
Yeah.
And
it's a small investment from his church that he stole. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's the way we're going to go. All right. So he takes a little like investment.
The bonds were not
bonds.
his.
Yeah. The bonds. And then he turns into like, becomes like invest in real estate and businesses and like assumes like a huge wealth that he never had in his life. And yeah, it's kind of like when you see famous people kind of abusing this, all this money that they never had before, this fame, this attention, and it just he kind of explodes from it. And, those humble beginnings of always doing good, helping others, being charitable. Nope.
Yeah. Well, and then, you have to make that decision too, is this because of his, is it nature versus nurture kind of thing?
Right.
Is it because he threw out that contract? Is it because that contract broke?
Right.
Did it break him too?
Yeah.
But again, going back to even just the artwork as you're, reflipping, this is like one of those comics you can just keep flipping through and flipping.
Absolutely.
Through, flipping
and, so going back to that subject of sequential art, we'll talk about that. One of the conversations we were doing some research was he was talking about paneling, and he wanted just one basic conversation to be a panel of you talk and there's one response and you're moving on to the next panel. And just that flow, I think he was very much a stickler of the flow of the story and the pacing.
Yeah, because you have to remember too, like when people are in a panel in a comic, they're sort of frozen in that moment. They're like a static spot. It's almost like a photograph, right? And it does pull you out as a comic book reader if there's 3 or 4 responses and no one has moved and no mouths have moved.
Right.
And that's where you see in some comics, they'll literally take the same panel and copy it and copy it and copy it. But the only thing that's moving is like eyes and mouths.
Right.
So you realize people are talking, but they're not moving.
Yeah.
But it keeps you in that conversation.
Sure.
But as soon as you keep layering in text and no one's moving, it's like the conversation becomes broken.
Right.
And so then
you're
like,
kind of bogged down. But
yeah, and you're like, I see what you're doing here. You're just trying to tell a big conversation without actually having the characters be real people.
Sure. And I mean, everybody has their own way and style of doing it, but man, he really set the tone for and the bar for like, this is how I do it, kids.
Well, and it's like every single panel too, it's like there's like a different light source.
Yeah, like, you were talking about that lighting.
Like light right in front of you, like light right behind you, and it's like silhouettes. And then all of a sudden there's this huge face on the panel, and then all of a sudden it's like you're looking down from above, and you're just all over the place. Which is great.
Like there's like when he goes back to the church after kind of trying to re-humble himself or trying to regrow, and he's like, you can write for me a new contract between me and my God. And so the main character is like hovering over these 3 like old men.
Yeah, they're like,
and it's really imposing
sniveling
on it. Yeah. And he's really trying to enforce like that kind of like that slumlord or trying to really realize this. And
well, they have him dressed like better too. He's in like a frilly coat,
right. He's kind of like a mob boss.
he broke his contract. He became a mob boss.
Yeah, right. If you will help me with this, I will also donate to the synagogue, the tenement at the Dropsie Avenue. This will provide me an income and believe, and he could redouble all their investment that he owed them and stuff like that. And they're like, I don't know if I want to do that.
Of course, they're
sell
like
out. Yeah.
3 incredibly old
men are like, what are we gonna do with it? It's not all religion a contract between man and a God.
Well,
He poses the question.
well, yeah, and that question too is like, is the contract within you? Is that just a contract of just you, your spirit to a spirit,
Right.
or is the contract literal? Because he sees it as it's a
Literal.
literal contract.
Right.
It's a real contract, and that we both have to hold up our end of the bargain, and that's how
Yeah.
he sees it, as an actual bargain.
Absolutely. And yeah, I kind of, yeah, it's that meaning, yeah, of, religion and, what do you keep to yourself? How do you express your beliefs? And what's that exchange like? And everybody kind of sees it differently. And he kind of throws that stone out of, of the contract in the world, and somebody picks it up. So yeah, and he has a little epilogue and things like that. And just wow, it was a really interesting story. That definitely it's more for people that like the history of comics that and going that, but also feel like want to put yourself in someone's shoes, or just kind of really just it's very interesting retrospective just to kind of
Well,
see as a time capsule almost.
yeah, and even the actual word graphic novel, like, here there's an epilogue. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, and in the comics there usually isn't an epilogue.
Right.
This is very much like you following through an actual book, like a
Right.
story, and the way that it's, I think, it like approaching you or really sinking in is because there's these visual elements that now are burned into your memory. Like, that's that guy, that's him, that's the slum landlord, that's the rabbis, like,
Right.
those are the people that
Yeah.
and I think that Will Eisner really saw that connection of like the best way to really get into someone's, I guess, memory is to have visual and text with it
Yes.
combined.
Absolutely. And in the epilogue, there's like a younger kid that picks it up and it says, "It's a contract with God. I will keep it." And so I think it's
I love that
almost
part too.
yeah.
What is this?
I
It's a
want
contract with God.
right. Well, it's interesting because like when the original character like started out, he was kind of already like middle-aged probably when he picks it up, middle to maybe his 60s when he picks it up. And for a kid to like start over with that fresh perspective,
Oh yeah,
that's kind of an
good point.
interesting like what if he could do it over again?
Yeah, yeah, and it's literally just a kid in the
Or
streets.
what would you tell your younger self if you were ever to go and revisit that? I thought that was kind of interesting.
I will keep it. Yes. Like, he already knows he's not going to break it. He's like,
Right.
I'm just going to hold true to this.
Yeah.
Hold
So
true to this contract with God.
such a cool story. Some of the other ones we'll mention, that we won't go super into, but that was part of this collection was The Street Singer. Very much it's about a guy who sings in the street for money, and or at least donations that people toss at him, and he gets invited back to somebody's place and gets offered a contract for success. Somebody will hire him to perform at their theater and says, "Oh, hey, meet me back later." Okay, he goes out there, has a good time, celebrates, and then he can't find out where she is.
And he keeps like going up and down the alleys,
Yeah,
looking, right? Like, he's
and
totally
singing in the street. Yeah.
lost.
So that was really interesting.
Again, just like real stories that could happen to real people, but also I think you could pull a lot of like little allegories off of that, and pull like side stories and interpret it a lot
Right.
different ways, just
Yeah.
and then the third story,
Yeah, the super. That one's probably the most hard to read. I don't think that one aged as well.
So the
Or at
super
least-
is
yeah.
like a superintendent of apartment building.
yeah, he's kind of like the maintenance guy.
Yeah, that's true. He's just this like big kind of brooding,
yeah, the kind of ogre almost.
like lives in the basement,
Yeah,
by the furnaces kind of thing.
Yeah, that one's a little hard to read, but there's definitely a lesson to be learned from it. We'll say that. And then
Just beware. That's
beware of that one. And then
Now, Contract with God's like 50 pages, 60 pages?
So the whole graphic novel of itself is 180
with all three of the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But they're like,
I would say this only
full page,
yeah.
They're full pages, but they're also, it's not like you would think a regular comic book.
Sure. And like the last story, the Cookling, that was kind of like his longest story, I felt like, in here. Basically, this family, they live in the country and they leave for the city. Or no, it's they live in the city, they leave for the country. Sorry. And
moving on up.
yeah, moving on up, they want to get out of town, they want to escape. They make some questionable decisions of, oh, if I did it this way, if I did it that way, and really learning some different experiences. And it's kind of like that, what if I were to take this path, what if I were to take that path, maybe I shouldn't have cheated on that or stop doing that affair, or what if I kept what if I had this relationship, or just answering all those different possibilities of what could happen. And
the many avenues you can take, right?
you could take what if you were wealthy and famous, and what if you were poor but had a great life? So you kind of really explores like different kinds of life and life styles and things like that.
Well, that's kind of like Will Eisner taking that look, because again, some of his other work, I guess his most popular one, other than this one, is easily The Spirit. Like everyone just knows that, and that one went on for years and years, and it was talking about all of those themes as just real people themes.
Yes, absolutely. Like I guess the most heroic one was The Spirit, but yet it was kind of like a really
like
noir.
Even Will Eisner said at that time they weren't calling them superheroes. No. They just said they were costumed or
sure,
costume fighters, or
I could see that,
caped things,
absolutely,
because they just didn't see them as superheroes. They just saw them as regular people in costumes that were doing these deeds or had these powers. Like a lot of them had supernatural powers, because that was easier for them to explain supernatural powers at the time, instead of just saying they got their powers from an alien rock or whatever. They weren't really thinking about it at that time.
Right. And it's kind of funny. He talks about like one of his peers that he actually had like classes and professional work with was Bob Kane.
Bob Kane.
So he was actually
creator of Batman.
Yeah. And if you think of all the people that he was working with at that time, they were all really trying to figure out what would catch fire, what was really groundbreaking at the time, generating new ideas, working together, collaborating, I think was so easier. They were still fighting for jobs and really trying to make ends meet, but
and at that time too, with comic books in the 40s and 50s,
the newspaper strips,
a lot of people did the newspaper strips. I saw a little article, a little interview with Will Eisner a while ago, and he said he didn't want to be a newspaper strip artist because they were never challenged to grow. They never. You
only have just a very thin. How much you could do.
A lot of those, if you think back, like Dennis the Menace and Peanuts and all that. They look the exact same for 40 years.
Right.
It's because the newspapers and everywhere else, they don't want you to change that style. Look at The Simpsons. The Simpsons have been the same forever, right? So, like, that's and he wanted to grow and really stretch his imagination and try his different art styles and just be experimental. But like the 40s and 50s, they were very much just trying to make anything, like you said, make it stick.
It stick.
How about this guy? How about this one? He runs around at night. And how about this? He has a really strong sidekick. And how about this one? He has a horse that, is made out of vapor. And, they just tried to keep going. Where now comics and comic book movies, they're using the same characters because they're becoming legacy characters that you just can't, they just know them. So they don't have to spend too much time world building.
Right. Yeah.
But back then they had to just keep trying it. How about this? And how about that?
Right. But it was really interesting. He kind of, he was really a big proponent for like his creative rights, really kind of understand the comic book industry. He really helped mentor a lot of his peers and the next generation. Like one of the interviews I watched when I was preparing for the show was Frank Miller and Klaus Janson, 100 Years of Genius, the life and legacy of Will Eisner. And it's Klaus Janson kind of having this conversation with Frank Miller at the School of Visual Arts. And he's talking because Will Eisner was like a faculty member of the time and left this huge legacy. And I'm just, teaching there and whatnot. And Frank Miller was just a huge fan of his, and really like debated Will Eisner so much, and because he was the next generation, and he was critiquing like Frank Miller's paneling on Daredevil, because that's what he had with him at the time that he showed him. He's like, you can do a little better, this a little better. I'm like, who could critique Frank Miller?
Change this, too much shadow over
right?
here. Yeah.
But what a conversation to be there for.
Yeah, right.
It's pretty incredible. What he was able to accomplish at the time, and what he changed for comics and the industry. It's pretty incredible.
I mean, I just can't even get over when you're looking through it too, like the finesse of his lines. Like he just like literally, he probably was just like flick, flick, and like there was an eye, flick, flick, flick. There's a mouth. Like he just knew it. He was just trained so well. And you do watch some of those old artists, cartoon artists, and they fly through their characters because they've just drawn them so many times that they could just come up with that.
Oh, right.
And each one of his characters have so much like quirky emotion, and like the way they move,
they're all
their
very
bodies.
expressive. Yeah, absolutely.
Their arms are never just hanging by their sides. Their legs are always kind of like bent and moving. It's like there's just so much activity and just a lot of like energy in this, and that alone is just so exciting to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
and
people talk about a true master at their work, and that's
yes,
pretty much that.
Yeah. And throughout it says, throughout this career, Eisner received numerous honors and awards worldwide, including only the second Lifetime Achievement Award bestowed by the National Foundation for Jewish Culture. In 2005, as one of his final projects, he created this trilogy, and then they made literally an award called the Will Eisner Awards.
Yeah.
That's literally every year I believe it's at San Diego Con. They honor, like, they pick the best of the industry and award it. However you feel about who awards what, at least it's a recognition of our industry. And people like still say, hey, they put that stamp on a book and say, this is a Eisner Award.
Yeah,
right. So
still respected,
absolutely. And I think still, for people who like the history of comic books, seeing the evolution of the medium grow, treating comics and graphic novels like with respect, putting that next to a prose novel and things like that regarding that, like, I still believe that's very valued.
Yeah, I mean, you'll find this at bookstores, and that's the big difference too between graphic novels, is that you'll find them at bookstores now, more popular than before. But even when this came out, late 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, you'd find it at bookstores. And even at that time, comics were still not there.
Yeah, at least he didn't live long enough to see AI. I can only imagine he'd be like, what?
Yeah. Yeah. I always like the idea of like their art instruments too, because they're a lot of times you see them using the same pen and ink nibs for decades,
right?
Same illustration brushes, same sable brushes, same for decades. It's just really, really cool to see some of those instruments.
Yeah, feeling like be a fly on the wall, man.
You don't use them anymore.
All right. Any closing thoughts?
No. I mean, I do like this idea that we're getting into of just like really respecting artist-writer combos.
Yeah.
And, we've kicked around the idea of like a artist feature or, writer featurette kind of thing. And like this just kind of shows there's some really, really good guns out there still.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're continuing to explore it all. Marvel, DC, indie, independent, world, really like big, significant accomplishments in the industry, and so much more. And this has been another great episode of Bam Pow Comic Hour. This is Andrew Launer
and Chris Ramos
signing off.